It didn't begin with a public announcement, it began with a look. A glance exchanged across a polished palace corridor, sharp enough to cut through decades of royal protocol. When Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, walked past Queen Camilla without acknowledgment, seasoned courtiers felt the shift instantly. Something had fractured, and at the centre of it all was a collection of jewels long whispered about but never openly contested. Until now. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed that moment was not noise but silence, and in royal circles, silence is rarely empty. It is loaded, deliberate, and often more revealing than any statement ever issued. Those present that day would later suggest in hushed tones that the absence of even the smallest nod between Sophie and Camilla was not an oversight, it was a message. A calculated withdrawal of acknowledgement that carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Because within the monarchy, recognition is power, and withholding it is a form of quiet defiance. Reports suggest that tension between the two women had been building for weeks, perhaps even months, beneath the surface of carefully managed appearances. Small details, missed glances, delayed responses, an unusual stiffness during shared engagements had begun to accumulate, forming a pattern that insiders could no longer ignore, even if the outside world remained unaware. At the center of these murmurs was something far more significant than personality or preference. It was the growing speculation surrounding a collection of royal jewels pieces, not merely valuable in material terms, but steeped in meaning, history, and expectation. Aides, bound by discretion yet unable to completely silence concern, reportedly began referencing these items in coded language, as though even naming them directly risked crossing an invisible line. And that perhaps was the first indication that this was no ordinary disagreement. Because when objects become unmentionable, they are no longer just possessions, they are symbols of something much larger. Different interpretations of internal conversations describe a private disagreement that may have taken place weeks earlier, one that never reached official acknowledgement, but left a lasting impression on those close enough to witness its aftermath. It is said that voices were never raised, that protocol was never broken outright, yet the atmosphere shifted in a way that could not be undone. And then, as if by unspoken agreement, the matter was buried. No statements, no clarifications, only a carefully maintained silence that, to outside observers, appeared as stability but to insiders, felt like pressure building beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the media, often quick to seize even the smallest hint of royal discord, remained unusually restrained. Palace insiders suggest that this was no coincidence. There are moments when information simply doesn't escape, when the machinery of discretion tightens its grip, ensuring that speculation never becomes confirmation. And yet, even in that controlled silence, there were whispers, subtle suggestions that something was off, something unresolved, something waiting. Not personal, but institutional. Not fleeting, but deeply rooted. Because this was not just about who wore what, or when, but about who had the right to claim it at all. And as those whispers grew louder behind closed doors, one truth began to emerge with chilling clarity. This was not the beginning of a conflict. It was the resurfacing of one that had never truly disappeared, only hidden, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. But what appeared to be a personal rift was, in truth, the resurfacing of a far older claim, one rooted in legacy, entitlement, and a royal inheritance that was never meant to be contested. Long before they became the center of whispered disputes, the jewels in question were never just ornaments. They were legacy symbols of continuity, duty, and a lineage stretching back through generations of royal women. And according to palace historians, their intended path was never ambiguous, which makes their sudden reappearance under unexpected ownership all the more unsettling. To understand why this moment carries such weight, one must step beyond the surface and into the deeper, almost sacred architecture of royal inheritance. These were not pieces selected at random, nor gifts passed casually between members of the family. They belonged to a carefully maintained tradition, one that, according to various interpretations of royal protocol, had been shaped over decades by figures who understood the monarchy not as a collection of individuals, but as a living institution. At the center of that philosophy stood Queen Elizabeth II, whose approach to legacy was often described as meticulous, deliberate, and quietly uncompromising. Insiders whisper that during her reign, nothing of significance was left to chance, especially when it came to items carrying both symbolic and historical gravity. Jewelry, in this context, was never merely decorative, it was narrative. Each piece carried with it an unspoken expectation, a role to be fulfilled, a continuity to be preserved. Reports suggest that certain collections were always intended to follow a defined path, moving not simply from one individual to another, but through carefully chosen custodians who embodied the values those items represented. And in that quiet, structured vision, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh was, according to those familiar with internal discussions, often seen as a natural steward. Not because of entitlement, but because of alignment with duty, with discretion, and with the understated strength that had come to define her position within the royal fold. There is also a crucial distinction, one that rarely reaches public conversation but holds immense significance within palace walls: the difference between personal jewelry and pieces that exist in a more ambiguous space, hovering between private ownership and institutional symbolism. Some items may technically belong to individuals, yet are treated, in practice, as extensions of the crown's identity. They are worn, displayed, and preserved not as personal expressions, but as markers of continuity. And it is within this blurred boundary that the current tension appears to have taken root. Because when such pieces shift hands unexpectedly, it does not feel like a simple transfer, it feels like a disruption. Different interpretations of palace records and informal agreements suggest that the intended custodianship of these jewels was never openly contested. It was understood, quietly accepted, reinforced over time through precedent rather than proclamation, which is why their sudden association with Queen Camilla has raised questions that no official statement has yet addressed, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently, in the spaces where protocol meets perception. And perhaps that is what makes this situation so quietly unsettling. Because nothing has been declared, yet everything feels altered. The past, once considered stable, now seems open to reinterpretation. The future, once mapped with careful precision, now carries uncertainty. And somewhere within that shift lies the realization that even the most carefully preserved legacies are not immune to change, especially when the lines between tradition and authority begin to blur. Yet somewhere along that carefully planned path, the chain of custody appeared to shift quietly, unexpectedly, and in a way that would soon ignite one of the most delicate disputes the modern monarchy has faced. It wasn't a public declaration. There were no speeches, no official documents released, only a quiet but unmistakable shift. Queen Camilla began appearing with pieces that insiders immediately recognized and just as quickly questioned. Because these weren't simply borrowed heirlooms, they were items many believed had already been promised elsewhere. At first, the appearances were subtle, almost easy to overlook unless one knew exactly what to look for. A bracelet here, a brooch there, nothing dramatic, nothing overtly provocative. But within palace circles, recognition is instant. These are individuals trained almost instinctively to remember lineage through objects, to trace history not through words but through what is worn, when, and by whom. And so when those pieces surfaced under Camilla's possession, it did not go unnoticed. It created a ripple, quiet, controlled, but undeniably real. Reports suggest that several aides were caught off guard, their reactions carefully masked but internally unsettled. Because this was not how such transitions were meant to occur. Not like this. Not without acknowledgment. Insiders whisper that what followed was not immediate confrontation, but confusion layered, persistent, and increasingly difficult to contain. Different interpretations of internal conversations describe a growing sense that something had shifted behind closed doors, something never formally communicated yet already in motion. The phrase unofficial reassignment began to circulate in hushed tones, not as a confirmed reality, but as a possibility that no one felt comfortable naming directly, and that ambiguity, more than any confirmed fact, became the source of rising tension. Because, in a system built on clarity of rank and order, uncertainty is destabilizing. It invites questions. It erodes trust. Meanwhile, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, remained publicly composed, her demeanour unchanged, her role carried out with the same quiet discipline that had long defined her presence within the monarchy. But those familiar with the subtle language of royal behaviour suggest that absence can speak just as loudly as action. The absence of acknowledgment, the absence of reaction, the absence of any visible engagement with what was unfolding. And in that restraint, there was something unmistakable, an awareness, a calculation, perhaps even a decision forming beneath the surface. The lack of clarification from official palace channels only deepened the unease. No statements were issued, no explanations offered, and in that silence, speculation found space to grow. Media insiders, often reliant on fragments and patterns, began to sense that something was off, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in a slow, deliberate shift that felt too controlled to be accidental. It was not chaos. It was something else. Something quieter, but far more deliberate. Behind the scenes, early signs of division reportedly began to emerge. Not openly, not in ways that could be easily defined, but in subtle alignments: who spoke to whom, who remained distant, who chose silence over engagement. These are the fractures that rarely make it into public view, yet they are often the most telling, because they reveal not just disagreement, but positioning. And positioning within the monarchy is never without consequence. What may have seemed like a simple matter of access or preference was, in reality, something far more serious, because Sophie was not prepared to let the matter remain unchallenged. There was no confrontation, no dramatic exchange. Instead, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, did something far more effective. She waited. And then, with the precision of someone who understands both protocol and power, she made her move. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively enough that those inside the palace knew instantly the balance had shifted. Because waiting in this world is never passive. It is strategic. It is calculated. And according to those familiar with the inner workings of the royal household, Sophie's silence was not uncertainty, it was preparation. Reports suggest that in the days following the quiet emergence of the dispute, she began a series of private conversations, carefully timed and deliberately contained. No large gatherings, no visible summits, just controlled, one-on-one discussions with individuals whose influence does not rely on public recognition, but on proximity to the mechanisms that quietly sustain the monarchy itself. These were not emotional appeals. They were precise, measured engagements rooted in understanding of precedent, of protocol, and of the invisible framework that determines who holds what and why. Insiders whisper that documentation became central to these conversations, not dramatic revelations, not explosive discoveries, but something far more powerful in a system built on continuity, records, prior agreements, historical expectations, the kind of material that does not shout, but endures. Different interpretations of these exchanges suggest that what was being revisited was not merely ownership, but intention. What had been planned, what had been understood, what had never required explanation because it had always been clear. And in bringing those elements back into focus, Sophie was not introducing conflict, she was re-establishing order. At the same time, there were indications of quiet alignment forming around her, not through declarations, not through visible gestures, but through presence and support that revealed itself in subtle ways. Conversations extended longer than expected. Meetings that might have been brief became deliberate. The tone, insiders suggest, shifted. Because when individuals within the monarchy begin to recognize a pattern, they respond not publicly but structurally. And in those structures, influence begins to take shape. What made Sophie's approach particularly striking was its restraint. There was no visible frustration, no attempt to force acknowledgment, no break from the composed role she had always maintained. Instead, she leaned into the very system that had defined her position for years. Protocol became her language. Precedent became her argument. And in doing so, she avoided the chaos of confrontation while quietly strengthening her position in a way that could not easily be dismissed. Palace insiders would later describe this phase as a quiet but firm reclamation, a process that unfolded not through conflict but through clarity. Meanwhile, the pressure began to shift, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly but undeniably. Because in a structure where silence often protects, it can also isolate. And as Sophie's position became more defined behind the scenes, questions began to form not directed outward, but inward, toward Queen Camilla and the circumstances that had allowed the situation to arise in the first place. There were no direct challenges, no overt demands, just a growing expectation, quiet, persistent, and increasingly difficult to ignore that a response, at some level, would eventually be required. But this wasn't just about reclaiming jewelry, it was about reasserting boundaries within a monarchy already navigating fragile internal dynamics. Inside the palace, the atmosphere reportedly shifted overnight. Conversations became guarded, invitations reconsidered, and in the midst of it all stood King Charles III, caught between loyalty, legacy, and the quiet but undeniable consequences of a dispute that refused to stay buried. Because what had once been contained within whispers was now pressing against the structure itself, testing its ability to hold firm under pressure. Reports suggest that Charles found himself in a position that few monarchs openly acknowledge, forced to navigate not just the duties of the crown, but the competing gravitational pulls of those closest to him. On one side, the steady, measured presence of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose actions had remained rooted in protocol and precedent. On the other, the complex reality of Queen Camilla, whose position within the monarchy carried both authority and, increasingly, scrutiny. And between them, a silence that demanded resolution without ever explicitly asking for it. Insiders whisper that internal discussions began to intensify, not in grand assemblies, but in smaller, more controlled settings where words could be measured and implications carefully managed. Different interpretations of these meetings suggest a growing awareness among senior royals that this was no longer a matter that could simply fade with time. The issue had weight. It had history, and perhaps most importantly, it had the potential to shape perceptions far beyond the palace walls if left unresolved. Because the monarchy does not operate in isolation, it exists under constant observation, where even the smallest fracture can be magnified into something far more consequential. Within this environment, courtiers reportedly found themselves navigating a delicate balance of allegiance, not openly, not in ways that could be easily defined, but in the subtle shifts that reveal where confidence truly lies. Conversations became more cautious, responses more measured, and in those quiet adjustments, lines began to form not as divisions, but as positions. Because in a structure built on hierarchy, even the perception of imbalance can ripple outward, affecting everything from internal cohesion to public trust. Concerns about perception began to take on a new urgency. Palace administrative streams, ranging from discreet advisory channels to long-standing institutional safeguards, reportedly turned their attention toward one central question: what happens if this becomes visible? Not just hinted at, not quietly speculated, but openly recognized. The answer, according to those familiar with these discussions, was not simple. Because while the monarchy thrives on tradition, it also depends on stability, and stability, once questioned, can be difficult to restore. In response, there were signs of reinforcement. Protocol, already a defining feature of royal life, seemed to tighten, not dramatically but noticeably. Appearances were managed with greater care, interactions became more deliberate, and in some instances, subtle distancing was observed, joint engagements recalibrated, shared moments reduced, the kind of quiet adjustments that signal awareness without drawing attention. It was not avoidance, it was containment. A controlled effort to ensure that whatever was unfolding remained within the boundaries of what could still be managed. And yet, even within that controlled environment, the tension did not disappear. It settled. It lingered. It reshaped the way individuals moved within the system, influencing decisions that extended far beyond the immediate issue. Because at its core, this was no longer just about objects or ownership. It was about something far more fundamental: how authority is exercised, how legacy is protected, and how far one can move within the structure before the structure itself begins to respond. As tensions simmered beneath the surface, one truth became increasingly clear: this was no longer about a disagreement, but about defining who truly holds authority within the evolving royal structure. Then, without ceremony or announcement, the shift became visible. The same jewels that had quietly sparked weeks of tension appeared once again, but this time, where many had always believed they belonged. And in that moment, without a single word spoken, the message was unmistakable. When Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, stepped forward wearing the very pieces that had become the centre of quiet dispute, it did not feel like a display, it felt like a resolution, not declared, not explained, but understood. Because within the monarchy, visibility is rarely accidental. Every appearance carries intention, every detail is weighed, and every choice communicates something far deeper than words ever could. Reports suggest that those who had been following the situation closely recognized the significance immediately. This was not coincidence. It was confirmation. A subtle but decisive closing of a question that had lingered far longer than anyone expected. What made the moment so powerful was its restraint. There was no acknowledgment of controversy, no attempt to rewrite the narrative, no effort to draw attention to what had taken place behind closed doors. Instead, there was clarity, quiet, controlled, and absolute. Palace insiders would later describe it as a restoration of order, a return to what had always been understood, even if it had briefly been called into question. And in that restoration, there was something almost ceremonial, despite the absence of any formal recognition. Because sometimes, the most significant shifts occur not through announcement, but through presence. At the same time, the absence of Queen Camilla from similar displays did not go unnoticed. Not highlighted, not emphasized, but observed. And in a system where observation carries meaning, that absence spoke volumes. It was not framed as retreat, nor as concession, yet it contributed to a growing sense that the balance had been recalibrated. That something, somewhere, had been resolved not through confrontation, but through alignment with the deeper structures that govern royal life. Public perception, often slow to catch the subtleties of internal shifts, began to adjust. Media outlets, once cautious, started to piece together the narrative through patterns rather than statements. The reappearance of the jewels, the consistency of Sophie's presence, the quiet absence of contradiction, these elements formed a story that did not need to be told outright. It revealed itself, gradually, but unmistakably. And with that revelation came a shift in understanding. What had once been speculation now carried the weight of interpretation, and that interpretation began to settle into something more solid. Yet beneath that apparent resolution, there remained a deeper undercurrent, one that could not be fully contained by symbolism alone. Because while the immediate question of possession seemed to have found its answer, the process that led to it had left its mark. Relationships had been tested. Boundaries had been examined. And the structure itself had been forced, however quietly, to respond. That kind of movement does not simply disappear. It lingers, reshaping the way future decisions are made, the way authority is exercised, and the way legacy is protected. And so, even as the jewels returned to their expected place, the story did not end, it evolved. Because within the monarchy, every resolution carries the seed of what comes next, every restoration hints at what was nearly lost, and every moment of quiet triumph is shadowed by the knowledge that it had to be fought for in the first place. But while the jewels had returned to their expected place, the implications of what had happened were far from over. Victory in royal terms is rarely loud, but its consequences echo. And as the dust began to settle, those closest to the situation understood something deeper had changed. Not just who wore the jewels, but how power itself was quietly being redefined within the monarchy. Because beneath the calm surface of restored appearances, something far more intricate had taken place, an adjustment, subtle yet undeniable, in the balance of influence that shapes every decision behind palace walls. Reports suggest that within senior royal circles, perceptions began to shift, not dramatically, not in ways that could be easily declared, but in the quiet recalibration of trust and authority. Where uncertainty had once lingered, there was now a renewed clarity about who operated within the boundaries of tradition, and who had, even briefly, stepped beyond them. And in that clarity, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, emerged not as a challenger, but as something far more significant, a stabilizing force. Insiders whisper that her handling of the situation, measured, restrained, and firmly anchored in protocol, did more than resolve a dispute. It reinforced a standard. A reminder that within the monarchy, strength is not displayed through confrontation, but through control, through patience, through an unwavering alignment with the institution itself. And as that perception took hold, it began to influence how she was viewed, not just in the context of this moment, but within the broader framework of the monarchy's future. Because influence, once recognized, does not fade easily. It settles. It expands. It reshapes the landscape around it. At the same time, the position of Queen Camilla appeared to undergo a quieter recalibration. Not publicly, not in any way that could be directly observed, but within the subtle language of royal dynamics. Appearances were maintained, roles continued, yet there was a sense difficult to define but impossible to ignore that something had shifted. Not diminished, but adjusted. Because in a structure built on hierarchy, even the smallest disruption can lead to a re-examination of boundaries, and once those boundaries are tested, they rarely return unchanged. Across the institution, there were signs of renewed emphasis on tradition. Protocol, always present, seemed to carry additional weight, as though the system itself was reinforcing its own foundations. Conversations became more deliberate, decisions more carefully aligned with precedent. It was not a reaction, it was a reinforcement. A quiet but firm reminder that the monarchy endures not through flexibility alone, but through its ability to return to what has always defined it. And in that return there was both reassurance and warning. Meanwhile, the media, once hesitant, began to piece together the narrative through fragments that now felt more cohesive. Patterns that had seemed isolated were reinterpreted as connected. Moments that had passed quietly were revisited with new understanding. And as that narrative took shape, it extended beyond the immediate situation, raising questions that could not easily be dismissed. If this could happen once, if even a carefully structured legacy could be momentarily unsettled, then what else might be vulnerable to similar shifts? That question lingered, unresolved, carrying with it a sense of quiet anticipation. Because within the monarchy, every event exists within a larger continuum. Nothing is isolated. Nothing is without consequence. And what had unfolded here was not simply a dispute resolved, it was a precedent established, a signal sent, a boundary redrawn in ways that may not fully reveal themselves until much later. Because in the monarchy, nothing exists in isolation, and what happened here may shape far more than a single dispute. In the end, it was never just about jewels. It was about legacy, who protects it, who defines it, and who has the authority to carry it forward. And as this quiet conflict revealed, Even the smallest symbols can carry the weight of an entire institution. Because what unfolded behind palace walls was not simply a disagreement over possession, it was a moment of reckoning, one that forced the monarchy to confront a question it rarely faces so directly: what truly sustains it? Reports suggest that beneath the surface of protocol and tradition lies a fragile balance, one that depends not only on hierarchy, but on shared understanding. An understanding that certain things are not owned in the conventional sense; they are held, preserved, and ultimately passed forward as part of something larger than any individual. And in that context, the jewels became something more than objects. They became a test of continuity, a test of restraint, a test of whether the structures carefully built over generations could withstand even the slightest deviation. And in navigating that test, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, did not position herself as a challenger, but as a guardian. Not through force, not through visibility, but through alignment with the very principles that define the monarchy itself. Insiders whisper that this is what ultimately gave her position its strength, not the claim itself, but the way it was asserted. Quietly, deliberately, without breaking the system she sought to protect. At the same time, the role of Queen Camilla becomes more complex when viewed through this lens, because her actions, according to different interpretations, may not have been driven solely by intent to disrupt, but by an attempt, however misaligned, to navigate a changing structure. The monarchy, after all, is not static. It evolves, adapts, redefines itself in response to shifting realities. But within that evolution lies a risk, because when adaptation moves faster than tradition can absorb, it begins to resemble overreach. And overreach, within an institution built on continuity, rarely goes unanswered. This is where the deeper tension emerges, not between individuals, but between forces. Stability and change, preservation and adaptation, the need to honor what has been, and the pressure to redefine what comes next. And it is within that tension that the true significance of this moment becomes clear. Because the monarchy does not survive by choosing one over the other, it survives by maintaining a delicate balance between both. A balance that must be constantly negotiated, quietly defended, and, when necessary, firmly restored. The enduring power of symbolism is what makes that balance possible. Objects, gestures, even silence, they all carry meaning that extends far beyond their immediate context. They become signals, markers of alignment, indicators of where the institution stands and where it is willing or unwilling to bend. And in this case, the symbolism was unmistakable, not because it was declared, but because it was understood. And perhaps that is the most revealing aspect of all. That in a world so often defined by visibility, the most powerful moments remain unseen. Decisions made in private, boundaries reinforced without announcement, legacies protected not through spectacle, but through quiet, unwavering resolve. Because in the end, what matters is not who speaks the loudest, but who holds the line when it matters most. Because within the monarchy, possession is never just ownership, it is a statement of trust, of duty, and of who the future truly belongs to. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.